Hi, everybody, and welcome to your lesson on rhetorical appeals. So, you might remember from a previous lesson when I talked about rhetoric, and rhetoric has to do with the choices an author makes to have an intended effect on their audience. So, the author has some goal that they're trying to achieve with what they wrote. They have an audience they're trying to influence, they're trying to have some effect on that intended audience. So, in order to have that effect, they're going to make some choices, and that is the author's rhetoric. So right now we're looking at what are called appeals, and these are just kind of different general ways the author tries to reach the audience and influence the audience. Usually my students have heard of rhetorical appeals, or some of my students have, and there's three that most students have heard of. So for those students, I add in a fourth one just to kind of keep things interesting. So if you are familiar with rhetorical appeals, you might still have some stuff to learn here. If you've never heard of them before, you're going to learn about them right now, okay? So the four that I teach are logos, pathos, and I have heard these pronounced different ways. So pathos, pathos, ethos, sometimes I've heard of ethos. And the one that most of my students haven't heard of is kairos. So that's new to some of my students. The others might be new to some of you as well. So let's look at these a little bit more closely. And again, I'm going to be using the Forbes article that we did for Unit 2 and 3, just to show you some examples. But remember that you will be focusing on your selected reading 4 for the Unit 4 work. Okay, so logos is an appeal to logic and reason. It's focused on the message, factual evidence, and also like a consistent and clear argument. All right. So where you might see appeals to logos is if the author relies on facts, statistics, expert opinions, research studies. So we did see some of that in the Forbes article. So where we see him appealing to logos, when he has these this specific factual information here, when he has these expert testimonies from Chuck Schumer, Nancy Pelosi, and there's Larry Summers. He has a research study at the end from here, study by researchers, and we have some statistics or some factual evidence there, some numbers. I thought we had the Brookings Institution in this one also. Yes, the Brookings Institution, which is a think tank. Okay. So we see a lot of logos throughout his article. All right. So you would look through your article and see how often your author is using that type of evidence, and that would help you evaluate their appeal to logos. Okay. The next one is pathos or pathos, and this is an appeal to emotions, but also the audience's values and beliefs. So sometimes my students who are familiar with pathos, they talk about an emotional appeal, but you can also think about the values and beliefs that the audience has. Now, there's a couple different ways, so this focuses on the audience. And this is why one of the things I have you do is that analysis of the rhetorical situation. So that was sort of an optional thing I had you work on in a previous lesson. And one of the reasons I have you do that is to really evaluate the author's use of pathos. You have to really understand who their intended audience is. So it helps to be able to identify that audience to really talk about pathos. Right. Some of the ways you might see pathos being brought into an article. Description, anecdotes, hypothetical scenarios. Forbes doesn't have a lot of this, but some of the other articles that you're reading for the Unit 4 work definitely have some of these kind of descriptions, maybe some anecdotes. So you'll see that in some of the other ones. Forbes doesn't do that too much. Quotations from someone who's been personally affected by the issue. Again, Forbes has more quotes from experts, not somebody who, say, has a lot of student loan debt or anything like that. So he's not really using a lot of pathos in that way. Also, we will be talking about word choice and language use in another lesson, But if you notice that the author is using language that's trying to make the readers, make the audience feel a certain way, you could call that an appeal to pathos. Now, eventually, you'll have to decide how you want to discuss that in your essay. So you couldn't have a paragraph where you say the author strengthens their argument with their appeal to pathos and discuss the word choice, and then have another paragraph where you discuss word choice, because you'd be double dipping then. All right, so eventually you will make that choice about how you're going to discuss the author's word choice. So with Forbes, he doesn't have a lot of those first couple appeals to pathos, like description or quotations from individuals. He has expert quotations, but not like everyday people. His language sometimes is appealing to pathos. So, like when he says, "Why another moratorium?" Like when he asks these questions, um, we know where that has led us. I can see that he's trying to appeal to his audience's kind of sense of frustration, maybe. So that could be an appeal to pathos, or we could discuss that when we talk about language. All right. So that would be our pathos. Okay. Ethos is the appeal to the author's credibility. Now, where sometimes people, so this focuses on the actual writer, so like Forbes, or speaker, if you're listening to a spoken argument. So it's focusing on their background, their credibility, their trustworthiness. Now, what some students do mistakenly is they talk about the author's background that they look up, like they might, Google the author and find out what their background or their expertise is. To me, that's not really the author's use of ethos, because I look for their appeal to ethos in what they are writing. All right. So in the article itself, where does the author refer to their own credibility? Anyone who's doing the Bloomberg article, you'll see it in there where they talk about their experience, Bloomberg and Myers. I'm trying to think who else. I think that's the only one I can think of off the top of my head that actually has that, where they say, our experience doing all this shows that we know what we're talking about. I'm paraphrasing there. But it's when the author in their article, they refer to their background, their experience. Forbes doesn't really do that. I don't see it often in the articles that we work on in these classes, but once in a while you'll see the author referring to themselves and their background. All right, so they refer to their personal experience. Another way they can show ethos that you could discuss is that they really show that they did their homework, meaning that they did careful, thorough research. They really covered all the bases. Or if they are kind of fair in making their argument, where they acknowledge opposing viewpoints, right? They don't just ignore them. Okay. In that sense, I feel like Forbes does not establish ethos, because he does seem very biased in his argument, right? So that could be a weakness in an argument. Okay. Now, remember, you do not have to discuss all of the appeals in your paper, just the ones that you really have something that you can talk about. So if you just don't really have anything to talk about in terms of the author's appeal to ethos, you don't have to write about that. Okay. So you could just focus on one that you do have some stuff to talk about. All right. So this last one is the one that's new to pretty much all of my students, even those who are familiar with the rhetorical appeals. So this is an appeal to kairos. So kairos has it focuses on the timeliness of the message. So it's like the why here, why now, why should we be discussing this? The perfect moment to deliver a particular message. So you're going to hear language that refers to why we need to address this immediately. All right. So it might refer to current events. So Forbes, he kind of talks about the what's happening. I think he says that Wednesday, doesn't he say that just that previous Wednesday, Biden? Yeah, Joe Biden announced Wednesday he will cancel. So he's referring to something that just happened like a couple days before his article. I think his article was published the day after that announcement, if I remember correctly. So it might refer to current events. It might establish a deadline. We need to do this by this date, right? Um, it could make some predictions about what would happen if the audience listens or if the audience ignores the message. And again, there's sometimes, I don't know if I have it on here, I don't, language that kind of establishes a sense of urgency. Like if we don't do something right away, this terrible thing will happen, right? So we'll hear language that has a sense of urgency. Again, I think that Bloomberg and Myers definitely have this going on, and I have to think through the other ones if they do. So remember that what you'll do is you'll just submit your notes and I'll look it over. And if you're missing something, I'll be like, oh, remember when they do this? Okay. Because remember that these articles are the articles that you're doing for R4 are ones that I'm pretty familiar with. So when you submit your notes, I can look them over and say, okay, this is good. Or there's a little bit here that you might want to talk about, right? So that's the whole point of that planning document. So speaking of the planning document, let me go ahead and bring that up and show how you will complete that. Okay. So we're going to part 4 still. Okay. And I should remember I showed you the evidence one. And remember, we're not, it's not, yes, they have it or no, they don't, but it's like, is it really good? Is it sort of good? Is it not so good? Is it really bad? Okay. So we want to think of it in those terms. And then we'll also talk about topic sentences. So with Forbes, I mean, I think his logos is okay. I mean, it could be better, but it's okay. His pathos isn't his strongest thing. I think his ethos is actually, I would say, like pretty weak there. And Kairos, not his strongest thing. Okay. Um, so if I were going to pick one of these to talk about, remember we did topic sentences, and you only have to do 2 topic sentences for evidence and appeals together. All right. So I might move these, bump these down, cut. Let's bump these down here. I'm doing more than 2 because I'm an overachiever. You can do more than 2. All right. So if I want to do some about appeals, let's see. So his pathos is somewhat weak. His logos is somewhat strong. I could do something like this. Although Forbes appeal to logos, is relatively strong. He weakens his argument by not including enough appeals to pathos, right? So that could be one. Or Forbes' argument would be more effective if he had a stronger appeal to ethos. So remember the pattern in these topic sentences. Just like in the Unit 3 essay, we want to mention the author. Okay. We want to mention one of the strategies. So this time we're not really referring to the ideas in the article. We're referring to what he did, not what he said, but what he did. All right. Or how he wrote. So it's his use of evidence, his use of appeals, right? So we're going to refer to one of those in the topic sentence. And then we're basically going to say whether it's whether it strengthens or weakens the argument. We can also use words like it was effective use of pathos, ineffective use of ethos. So those are some other successful and unsuccessful. That's some language that might work in these topic sentences. But notice this pattern, right? And remember that in this essay, we are commenting on Forbes's rhetoric, all right, his choices as a writer. We're not commenting on the issue. And again, not Forbes for you all, right? You're choosing Bloomberg and Myers. It's either Samuelson or Robertson. I always get them mixed up. Bloomberg, Chen. I can't remember the 4th one. All right, you're referring to one of those authors. I'm just using Forbes again because it's an article that we're all familiar with. Okay, so that will help you with the appeals part. Oh, remember also to type some notes in here. So if I say that his ethos is very weak, I will say he doesn't refer to his own experience. He doesn't address opposing viewpoints, and his argument seems biased. Okay. Logos, he includes a lot of factual evidence to support his reasons. Facts, research studies, expert opinions. Right? Oops. Pathos doesn't really use any like personal stories. Or anecdotal evidence, but he does have word choice that appeals to emotions. Okay. Kairos only refers to the current proposal, but doesn't establish a deadline for action. All right, so you'll write a couple notes in there telling me why you rank each appeal the way you do. And then you'll choose, if you want to, choose one or two of those and draft a topic sentence. Remember that with these topic sentences, you're not committing to those. You're not saying that you're absolutely going to include that in your paper. You're just putting it out there as a possibility. And I'll give you some feedback on that. All right. So I hope that helps you to complete the second part of the evidence and appeals evaluation notes. So you're just doing these notes, submitting that. I'll see if you're catching what you need to catch and redirect you if you need to be redirected. All right. Let me know if you have any questions. Remember, this is new information, so you might be struggling with it a little bit. So I'm available if you have questions. All right. Take care. See you in the next lesson.